The dollar bill shook in Ezra Whitmore's aged hand, hoisted high above the jeering crowd. $1 for a human being. The auctioneer's hammer hovered in the dusty air of Millbrook's town square, and every pair of eyes turned to the stranger who made the most outrageous bid in the history of this twisted market. Ezra hadn't meant for it to happen. Just 20 minutes earlier, he had entered town looking for grain and a hot meal. Instead, he found himself facing a nightmare, an open slave auction, happening in broad daylight in 1871, 6 years after the Civil War was supposed to have ended. It was a horror too far beyond his understanding. The girl on the block couldn't have been older than 19. Her dark skin showed fresh marks from cruel beatings, but it was her eyes that caught Ezra's attention. They burned with fire that refused to die, a strength that no punishment could quench. When the bidding began at $50, Ezra's stomach churned, and when it climbed to $75, a storm of rage filled his chest. But then, in a moment of madness, his voice rang out, loud and clear, $1. The crowd fell silent, the laughter and murmurs dying instantly. The auctioneer, Silas Gentry, sneered down at him, his face twisting in disgust. "Did you say $1, stranger?" His voice was dripping with condescension. "This is prime merchandise, not some worn-out mule." Ezra's heart raced, but he stood firm. Around him, men in worn hats and tattered clothes began to murmur. Some chuckled, others looked angry, and a few looked downright dangerous. "You heard me right," Ezra repeated, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. $1. Take it or leave it. For a split second, the girl's gaze locked with his. It wasn't hope he saw in her eyes, but recognition. Something in him that she hadn't expected. Something different. Gentry's face turned red with fury. But before he could respond, a smooth voice interrupted. "I think we should honor the gentleman's bid." The crowd parted to reveal Marshal Boone, the town sheriff. His badge meant less than the dirt under his nails, and his cold, calculating eyes swept over Ezra, sizing him up like a predator watching prey. "After all," Boone continued, "a bid's a bid, and I'm curious to see what our visitor plans to do with his purchase." Ezra's spine stiffened. This wasn't a gesture of kindness. No, this was a trap. But he couldn't back down now. Gentry's hammer fell with a crack that echoed through the square. Sold to the stranger for $1. As Ezra stepped forward to claim the girl, whose name he didn't even know yet, he noticed the way the crowd closed in around them. Their faces were no longer just curious. They were hungry. A sickening realization crept through his mind. He had just made a terrible mistake. In Millbrook, nothing was as simple as it seemed. The shackles on the girl's wrist came off with a harsh clink, but the sound seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness. Ezra led her away from the town, toward his horse, thinking that he could simply unlock her chains and watch her disappear into the wilderness. A clean, simple escape. But he was wrong. "You need to run," he whispered urgently, glancing over his shoulder at the small groups of men still lingering in the square, watching them with eager interest. "Head north. There's a settlement 20 miles up the river." Her voice was quiet but firm, her words carrying an air of experience that spoke of education, not fieldwork. "You don't understand what you've done." Ezra stopped. "What do you mean?" "I just freed you." Her laugh was bitter, as cold as winter. "Freed me," she said. "You think Silas Gentry and Marshal Boone are going to let you walk away with their property? You think they held this auction for fun?" Before Ezra could speak, the sound of hooves cut through the air. Not one horse, but several, coming fast. "Too late," she muttered, and Ezra's heart sank. The first to appear was Marshal Boone, flanked by 3 men. Behind them rode a massive figure in black, his face marred by what looked like claw marks. When he smiled, 2 gleaming steel teeth flashed in his mouth, sharp as daggers. "Having second thoughts about your purchase, stranger?" Boone called out, his voice mocking. The riders closed in, circling them like wolves. Ezra's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but before he could reach it, Ketura's fingers touched his arm. "A warning," she whispered. "The big one is Iron Teeth McGrath," she murmured. "He's not here for the money." Ezra's blood ran cold. Iron Teeth McGrath. Even Ezra had heard whispers about him. He was a bounty hunter who didn't just hunt criminals. He collected human cargo, sold it to the highest bidder, and took pleasure in the work. Boone dismounted slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We've got a problem. That girl," he pointed at Keturah, "she's spoken for, been for months. Iron Teeth here came 200 miles to collect her." McGrath's voice was a gravelly growl. "The girl's mine, bought and paid for. Your little auction? Just entertainment." Ezra's mind raced, the pieces falling into place like bullets sliding into a chamber. This wasn't a random auction. It was a prearranged delivery. Keturah hadn't been sold to the highest bidder. She'd been waiting for McGrath to arrive. The auction was a show, a ruse to make it all seem legal. Boone smirked, his hand resting on his gun. "We could make this ugly," he said. "Or you could take your dollar back and ride out of town with your health intact." Ezra turned Keturah, his heart sinking as he saw the terror in her eyes. He saw something in her, the same stubborn dignity his daughter had shown before she died of fever 3 years ago. "What if I refuse?" Ezra asked. McGrath's steel teeth caught the sunlight, his grin widening. "Then I get to have some fun before I collect my property." The silence between them was taut, a wire pulled too tight. Ezra's horse shifted nervously, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. "You got 10 seconds to decide," Boone said. But Keturah's eyes widened as she looked past the men. Recognition, or perhaps terror, flashed across her face. "Now we're all dead," she whispered. Riding up the hill toward them was another group of riders. Their uniforms were too clean, too pristine, their formation too precise. Their leader was a man whose face carried the cold, calculating demeanor of someone used to giving orders. Ezra's heart skipped a beat. "Captain Thorne," Boone muttered under his breath, fear seeping into his voice. Iron Teeth McGrath's confident grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of concern. "What's the Army doing here, Boone? You said this territory was clean." Captain Thorne brought his men to a halt, his steely eyes scanning the scene. "Marshal Boone," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "This is quite the gathering." Boone forced a smile, but it was nothing more than a grimace. "Just some local business, Captain. Nothing the Army needs to worry about." Thorne's gaze locked onto Keturah. "I think you'll find that Miss Washington here is very much Army business." The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Washington? This wasn't just about slavery. It was about power, family, and secrets far deeper than he could have imagined. Keturah's spine straightened, her face betraying none of the terror she felt. McGrath reached for his gun. "Hold on there, Captain. That girl's my lawful property. I've got papers to prove it." Thorne's voice remained calm. "Funny thing about papers, McGrath. They can be forged, stolen, or in your case, bought from men who had no right to sell them." Ezra's mind was reeling. Federal cavalry pursuing a bounty hunter, a corrupt marshal, all over one freed slave? There had to be more to this story. "Miss Washington," Thorne continued, "your father is quite worried about you." "Father?" Ezra's understanding of the situation shifted once more. This wasn't just about a runaway slave. It was about family, secrets, and power. Keturah spoke for the first time since the soldiers had arrived. "My father sent you?" Thorne's smile was razor-thin. "In a manner of speaking, though I suspect he didn't expect to find you in such colorful company." McGrath was done with words. His gun cleared its holster in one smooth motion, faster than Ezra could react. "Enough talk. The girl comes with me." But Ezra was already moving, throwing himself sideways as McGrath's first shot splintered the air where his head had been. Keturah dropped behind his horse, and chaos erupted. Marshal Boone was shouting something about jurisdiction, Captain Thorne giving orders in clipped tones. But in the middle of the firestorm, Keturah was crawling towards something, a saddlebag that had fallen from one of the horses. Whatever was in that bag, she was willing to risk her life for it. And Ezra Whitmore's hand trembled as he raised a crumpled dollar bill high above the crowd. $1 for a human being, he called out. The auctioneer's hammer hovered in the dry, dusty air, and all eyes turned toward him, the stranger who dared make such an outrageous bid. 20 minutes earlier, Ezra had entered the small town of Millbrook, hoping to find supplies for his journey. Some grain, maybe a decent meal. Instead, he stumbled into a nightmare. Before him, on the weathered wooden platform, a young woman was being auctioned like livestock in the year 1871, 6 years after the war was supposed to have ended. But here in this town, the horrors of slavery were alive and well. The girl was no more than 19, her dark skin marred with the signs of recent beatings, but her eyes, they were full of defiance, a fire that refused to be snuffed out by the cruelty surrounding her. The bidding started low at $50, and Ezra's stomach churned. By the time it reached $75, rage bubbled up inside him, and in a moment of impulsive madness, he shouted, $1. The crowd fell silent, and the auctioneer, a greasy man named Silas Gentry, glared at him with contempt. "Did you say $1, stranger?" he sneered. "This here is prime merchandise, not some mangy mule." Ezra's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. Around him, the men in dirty hats murmured, some of them chuckling, others frowning or sneering, a few looking downright dangerous. "You heard me right," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. $1. Take it or leave it. The girl's gaze locked with his, and for just a moment, something passed between them. Not hope, not gratitude, but an understanding, a silent recognition. Gentry's face turned crimson with anger, but before he could speak, another voice interrupted. "I think we should honor the gentleman's bid." The crowd parted to reveal Marshal Boone, the town sheriff, a man whose badge meant less than the dirt under his nails. His pale eyes scanned Ezra with the calculating gaze of a predator. "After all," Boone continued, "a bid's a bid, and I'm curious to see what our visitor plans to do with his purchase." Ezra's gut twisted. This wasn't charity, it was a trap, but there was no turning back now. Gentry's hammer came down with a sharp crack, sealing the deal, sold to the stranger for $1. As Ezra moved toward the girl, whose name he didn't yet know, he realized that the crowd had started to close in around them. Their curiosity was no longer innocent. It was hungry, predatory. A sick feeling settled in his chest. He had just made a terrible mistake. Nothing in Millbrook was ever as simple as it seemed. The girl's shackles came off with a loud clink, but the sound echoed unervingly in the still air. Ezra led her toward his horse, thinking that once they were out of town, he could simply release her and watch her disappear into the wilderness. Clean. Simple. But he was wrong. "You need to run," he whispered urgently, his eyes darting back toward the square where groups of men lingered, watching them with ill intent. "Head north. There's a settlement about 20 miles up the river." Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying an air of knowledge and experience far beyond what her young age should have suggested. "You don't understand what you've done." Ezra froze. "What do you mean?" "I just freed you." Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Freed me? You think Silas Gentry and Marshal Boone are just going to let you walk away with their property? You think they held that auction for fun?" Before Ezra could respond, the sound of hooves broke through the tense silence. Not one horse, but several, coming fast. "Too late," she whispered, and Ezra's stomach sank. First to appear was Marshal Boone, flanked by 3 men. Behind them rode a massive figure in black, his face scarred, the gleam of steel teeth visible when he smiled. "Having second thoughts about your purchase, stranger?" Boone called out, amusement in his voice as his men formed a semicircle around them. Ezra's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but Ketura's fingers gently touched his arm. "A warning," she whispered. "The big one is Iron Teeth McGrath," she said, her voice barely audible. "He's not here for the money." Ezra's blood turned to ice. Iron Teeth McGrath. Even Ezra had heard the whispers in saloons across the territories. McGrath was a notorious bounty hunter who didn't just capture criminals. He trafficked humans, selling them to the highest bidder, and seemed to take a twisted pleasure in it. Boone dismounted, his eyes cold and calculating. "That girl," he pointed at Keturah, "she's spoken for. She's been waiting for McGrath here for months." McGrath's voice was like gravel, deep and menacing. "The girl's mine, bought and paid for. Your little auction? It was just a show." Ezra's mind raced. Try to piece it together. This wasn't an ordinary slave auction. It was a setup. Keturah hadn't been sold to the highest bidder. She'd been waiting for McGrath to arrive. The auction was a ruse, a way to make everything seem legal. And Ezra had walked right into it. Boone smirked, hand resting on his gun. "We could make this ugly," he said, "or you could take your dollar back and ride out of town with your health intact." Ezra glanced at Keturah, his heart heavy with the realization that she was no longer just a victim of slavery. She was caught in a web far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He saw something in her eyes that reminded him of his daughter. The same intelligence, the same fierce dignity. "What if I refuse?" Ezra asked. McGrath's steel teeth caught the light as his grin widened. "Then I get to have some fun before I collect my property." The silence stretched long between them, tight as a drawn bow. Ezra's horse shifted uneasily. Somewhere, a dog barked. "You've got 10 seconds to decide," Boone sneered. But Keturah's gaze shifted past the men, her eyes widening with what seemed like recognition, or maybe fear. A group of riders appeared on the hill, and whatever she saw in their faces made her whisper, "Now we're all dead." Riding up toward them were soldiers in fresh, pristine Union cavalry uniforms. Their formation was too precise, their demeanor too calm, their leaders cold. Calculating gaze made even seasoned outlaws uneasy. "Captain Thorne," Boone muttered under his breath, and Ezra could hear the fear in his voice. McGrath's confident smirk faded, replaced by something like concern. "What's the army doing here, Boone? You said this territory was clean." The leader of the cavalry, a lean man with prematurely gray hair and eyes like chips of ice, brought his unit to a halt. "Marshal Boone," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "This is quite the gathering." Boone's smile was strained. "Just some local business, Captain. Nothing that concerns the army." Captain Thorne's eyes locked on Keturah, and a chill ran down Ezra's spine. "Miss Washington," Thorne said, his voice chillingly calm, "you're very much army business." The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Washington? The girl he had just tried to free wasn't just a runaway slave. She was far more. The way her back stiffened at the mention of her full name made Ezra realize that he had only begun to scratch the surface of this tangled web. McGrath, his patience worn thin, reached for his gun. "Hold on there, Captain," he growled. "That girl's my lawful property. I've got papers to prove it." Thorne's voice remained unshaken. "Funny thing about papers, McGrath, they can be forged, stolen, or in your case, bought from men who had no right to sell them in the first place." Ezra's mind reeled as he pieced it together. Federal cavalry pursuing a bounty hunter? A corrupt marshal and a runaway slave? There was more to this story than he could have imagined. "Miss Washington," Thorne continued, "your father is quite worried about you." Keturah's voice broke the tense silence. "My father sent you?" Thorne's smile was razor-thin, in a manner of speaking, "though I suspect he didn't expect to find you in such colorful company." McGrath was done talking. His gun was out at holster in a smooth motion, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Enough talk. The girl comes with me." But Ezra was already moving, throwing himself sideways as McGrath's shot ripped through the air where his head had been. The chaos erupted into full-blown violence. Boone shouted something about jurisdiction, and Thorne barked orders at his soldiers. But in the middle of it all, Keturah was scrambling towards something, a saddlebag that had fallen from one of the horses. Whatever was inside that bag, she was willing to risk everything for it. And that meant Ezra would do whatever it took to help her get it. Ezra's eyes flickered over the crumpled documents in his hand. The weight of what he held seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Slave auctions, land grabs, and the crushing of freed slaves. He couldn't stomach it anymore. When he tried to hand over the evidence to the honest officials in Washington, they silenced him. Not them. He did. Captain Thorne personally shot him down in broad daylight, then claimed it was all part of resistance to arrest over corruption charges. He made it look like justice was being served, when in fact it was murder, a calculated move to silence a witness. Ezra's got twisted with realization. Thorne wasn't just corrupt. He was a murderer, a conspirator who would stop at nothing to protect the empire he had built on lies, manipulation, and the exploitation of the vulnerable. The realization came crashing down like an avalanche, cold and suffocating. He glanced over at Keturah, who was riding beside him, her expression grim. She must have known the truth for a while. Ezra's mind raced as the trail ahead narrowed, forcing them to ride single file along a narrow path. The cavalry behind them was closing in, but their larger numbers struggled to navigate the terrain. Ezra couldn't understand why Thorne didn't just destroy the documents. Why not burn them? Get rid of all of this, he asked, his voice tight with confusion. Ketura's gaze hardened as she replied, because he needs to know who else has copies. Her voice was steady but edged with anger. My father was paranoid. He made duplicates of everything and hid them in different places. The protocols aren't just evidence of crimes. They're a map to all the other evidence. Thorne needs them to clean up his mess. They crested a ridge and saw a mill field below, a cluster of weathered buildings nestled together. The telltale sight of telegraph wires stretching toward the horizon, offering a fleeting sense of relief. But their relief was short-lived. More riders approached from the east, at least a dozen men, all armed to the teeth. Mercenaries. Hired guns, not soldiers. Thorne must have sent word ahead, Keturah whispered. They were trapped. The soldiers were behind them. Gunmen were waiting in the town, and the telegraph office might as well have been a lifetime away. Ezra's heart raced. We'll make a stand at the old mine, he said, pointing toward a cluster of abandoned buildings halfway down the slope. We can hold them there. Keturah shot him a doubtful look. Make a stand? There are 20 of them and 2 of us. Then we'd better make those documents count for something, Ezra replied, his jaw set in determination. As they spurred their horses toward the mine, Ezra's thoughts flashed to his daughter, Sarah. She had been brave, too, fighting a fever that eventually took her life. The way she refused to give in, even when the odds were impossible, had always stuck with him. Maybe that's what courage really was. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to fight despite it. Behind them, the voice of Captain Thorne echoed off the canyon walls, promising his men extra pay if they brought back the protocols intact. But not once did he mention bringing back the people who were carrying them. Ezra understood what that meant. If they didn't surrender, this would end with their deaths. The mine offered little comfort, but plenty of places to hide. Broken timbers and rusted equipment littered the space, and the old shaft led deep into the darkness, a potential hiding place, or a trap, depending on how things played out. Ezra checked his ammunition. 12 rounds left. Not nearly enough. How many shots do you have? He asked Keturah. She held up Marshal Boone's pistol. 6, plus whatever I can scrounge up. They searched the area and found 2 more revolvers abandoned by long-gone miners, along with a box of old cartridges. They weren't much, but they'd have to do. From their position in the mine, they could see Thorne's men spread out around the mine, preparing to lay siege. Thorne had learned from his earlier mistakes. This time, he wasn't rushing in. He was playing the long game. Miss Washington. Thorne's voice carried over the rocks. You're surrounded. Surrender now, and we'll come in and take the documents. No more games. Keturah pressed herself against the wall beside Ezra, the protocol still clutched tightly in her hands. He's right, she said quietly. Even if we fight them off, the mercenaries in town will just ride up and finish what he started. Ezra's eyes flicked to the documents in her hands, his mind whirring. He scanned one of the pages, the one about the supply contracts. It detailed shipments of weapons that had supposedly been destroyed after the war, rifles, ammunition, even artillery pieces. But they hadn't been destroyed. They'd been sold to private buyers who weren't Confederate sympathizers. Ezra's voice was slow as he pieced it together. Look at these names. Mine owners, railroad companies, cattle barons, men who needed weapons to protect their interests, from hostile tribes, from desperate settlers. They didn't need them for defense. They needed them to expand their power. Keturah's eyes widened in understanding. You think some of those weapons might still be around? Hidden here? Ezra's mind raced. This was a major mining operation. The Millfield Mining Consortium bought enough rifles to outfit a small army. They began searching frantically through the debris, looking for anything that might be hidden. Most of the buildings were empty, stripped bare, but in the office of the mine, the safe door hung open, the contents long gone. But safes weren't the only place to hide things. The mine shaft, Keturah said suddenly. If I were hiding weapons, I'd put them somewhere nobody would think to look. They grabbed lanterns and descended into the dark, the sound of their boots echoing in the cavernous space. 20 feet down, Ezra's lantern illuminated something that made his heart race. A stack of wooden crates along the tunnel walls, covered with canvas tarps. Bless those paranoid mine owners, Ezra muttered as he pulled the first tarp away. Rifles, dozens of them, still wrapped in oilcloth. Ammunition boxes that looked like they'd been sitting there for years. Now we have a fighting chance, Keturah said, her eyes glinting with a new sense of determination. But even as they hauled the weapons to the surface, Ezra knew that having more guns wouldn't change their fate. They could fight longer, but in the end, it was just a delay before death. There's something else, Keturah said, as they positioned rifles at the mine's windows. Something I haven't told you about the protocols. Ezra turned, confused. What now? There's a list of federal judges who've been taking bribes, including Judge Morrison, the territorial judge who's supposed to be arriving in Millfield tomorrow. Ezra froze. Morrison? He's coming here tomorrow to try a cattle rustling case. Exactly, Keturah said, her voice cold. But if he sees these documents, he'll either help us expose the conspiracy, or he'll help them bury us. Ezra's mind raced. Then we need to keep him from seeing them, if we survive the night. As if on cue, the first shots rang out at dawn. Thorne's soldiers attacked from all sides, their military precision evident in every movement. But Ezra and Keturah had spent the night preparing. They used the mine's defenses to turn the fight into a slow, grinding battle. Rifle fire echoed as they fought to hold their position. Then, just as hope seemed to slip away, there was a new sound. The sound of gunfire coming from behind Thorne's men. Ezra peered through a crack in the wall, and to his astonishment, a new group of riders appeared. They wore blue uniforms, but not Thorne's corrupted unit. These were legitimate federal soldiers. Federal reinforcements, Keturah breathed, her eyes wide with disbelief. The leader of the new group was a young lieutenant who was shouting orders, clearly confused as to why army units were fighting each other. He had no idea that the battle unfolding before him was far more complex than it seemed. In his hands, the lieutenant carried a telegraph message. Ezra's stomach dropped when he recognized the handwriting. It was his own, Samuel Rollins, the mine foreman. He'd gotten suspicious when Ezra hadn't arrived as planned, and after piecing together enough of the story, he had sent for help. Ezra's heart pounded in his chest. Thorne was caught between the mine and the legitimate soldiers. In the chaos, the corrupt captain made his final play. "The documents!" he screamed. "Get those documents." But Keturah was already running. She sprinted from the mine, the protocols held high above her head. "Lieutenant!" she shouted to the approaching federal soldiers. "These papers contain evidence of treason." Thorne's last shot rang out, striking Keturah in the shoulder and spinning her around, sending the documents flying across the rocky ground. Ezra was there in an instant, placing himself between the fallen papers and Thorne, his rifle aimed at the captain's chest. "It's over, Thorne." For a moment, Thorne considered fighting, but he looked around at the soldiers closing in, at the protocols scattered across the ground, at Ezra's unwavering aim. He dropped his,